key lesson that I've taken away from my time as chairman of Essendon is that governance is critical. So one of the key themes that you can see from the Switkowski report, which the club had done early on, is that part of the reason these problems occurred was there was a bit of a no one's in charge sort of problem. Whenever you have an organisation where in reality the CEO is not the most powerful and important person in the room, and you get this, for example, in the Defence Department, police forces, where you might have a secretary of a department, but in truth, typically the real power lies with the person with the uniform, then you have additional governance challenges. Now, Defence and people like me in one of my current roles spend a lot of time grappling with how to deal with these kind of challenges, but it's something I think that Essendon failed to fully comprehend and understand. I suspect most other football clubs at that time probably were in the same boat. Football departments almost functioning as autonomous, separate little worlds. So getting a much better operating process, lines of accountability, understandings about who's responsible for what is a critical lesson.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright, a South Australian public servant. I'm on Kaurna land, and joining me today are two recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And from Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
So far in Season 2, we've looked at the post office scandal in the UK, and Danielle and Caroline have spent more time with founding Centrelink CE Sue Varden, talking about lawyers and about training. But when the AFL's illicit drugs policy hit the news again in March, Caroline begged us to do a couple of episodes on the Essendon supplement scandal of 2013.
Now, I'm not sure about this, to be honest, Caroline, and I think we've had this conversation in the lead up to this. I would like to know how on earth we can connect this to the Westminster tradition of government and governance. And you've got a fair bit of work. I could talk footy all day long, all day long, no trouble whatsoever. But you still have quite a bit of work in trying to convince me that this belongs on this podcast.
Look, not just you. I was actually telling a mate that we were doing it and she was like, oh, I'm never going to listen to that episode. But look, let me give you the highlights and see if some of this sounds familiar, right?
No pressure. No pressure. All yours.
An incoming high-profile leader with something to prove urges an old and storied organisation to pursue his vision, but of course, legally. The new internal execs sideline the old fuddy-duddies and start innovating at the edge of the boundaries of what's acceptable. No one writes anything down. No one does a proper risk assessment or tells the big boss what's going on. And it all blows up, and the people who face the consequences, with a few exceptions, are the little guys. You seeing some resonances here yet?
Yeah, right, you're getting there, but, you know.
We're calling AFL players the little guys? But okay.
Well, can I say it does surprise me that AFL players are in this story, the little guys. But in a few weeks we'll publish this interview I did with Andrew Podger, where he talks about the dangers of new brooms in organisations and losing corporate knowledge. Is that where we're going with this?
Yeah, this is definitely one of the things we're going. So in today's episode, I want us to talk about what happened in the Essendon Football Club in 2011 and 2012, which leads to the scandal in 2013, because it's a failure of governance. And recognising that maybe our audience is not all the way with us, we opened the episode with a grab from Lindsay Tanner, who was a former Minister of Finance, so definitely like in the public service space.
Loose thread, keep going.
But he was also the Essendon Club president from 2015. And in that grab, he's talking about the lessons from the drug scandal. And what he says is lack of good governance is why good people did bad things at Essendon, which, honest to God, I think could be a tagline for Robodebt. And it's one of the things why I'm really interested in Robodebt.
And most government failures, right?
Yes, because no one gets up in the morning to be a bad guy, and yet somehow bad things happen. So look...
Yeah.
In our next episode, we're going to talk about the governance within which Essendon is enmeshed, so both its relationship with the AFL Commission, but more importantly with WADA, the World Anti-Doping Authority, and ASADA, its local Australian government affiliate. And there are some public servants. We're going to talk about public servants even in the next episode. But I know, right? I'm bringing you there. But today I wanted to start talking about Essendon Football Club itself.
All right, go for it. Where does it all begin?
Well, it begins with the appointment of James Hird as coach in 2011. Now, Essendon's history as a football club, for those people who are not into football, and I'm thinking of you, Kim Little, their heyday was in the 90s and they last had a flag in 2000, and then they've had kind of no luck for a decade. Hird was their favourite son. He'd been their captain. He'd finished playing in 2007, and he's clearly a very smart and impressive guy, right? Like, not just as a football player. Big brain, big activity. So they bring him in.
Something you might not know, Caroline, is that because my team was kept out of the AFL for so long, I had to watch, you always had to, AFL was a part of VFL and then AFL was a part of life. And so I chose Essendon as the team that I followed, possibly because I had to make that decision at about the beginning of their heyday, and like all good 9 or 10-year-olds, you tend to pick people on the up, I tend to find. And so right up until that 2000 premiership, paid quite a lot of attention to Essendon before the people of South Australia and the rest of the AFL became less scared and enabled the mighty Port Adelaide Football Club into the AFL.
So that was literally, I think, just an excuse for Danielle to say the words Port Adelaide Football Club on the pod. So anyway,
not done yet, but keep going.
All right. So at 38, they appoint James Hird as coach in 2011, and he is he's the new great hope. He's going to revitalise them. And he comes in and he does a number of things. At the end of the 2011 season, he appoints a new high-performance team. That high-performance team come in to do weights to increase strength, and then a kind of morph. So they start doing a fitness strategy that involves supplements, and then the supplements kind of becomes a bigger thing as well. There's a sharp increase in the number of injections that players are getting. Players are getting treatment off-site. There are unfamiliar suppliers. The traditional medical staff are kind of being sidelined in this process. So you've gone from kind of quite a traditional club to suddenly stuff is happening in the footy department that looks and feels quite different in pursuit of
sus, as the kids might say.
Well, I think they thought it was exciting and
new and progressive and cutting edge.
Yeah, as you would say.
Cutting edge.
Yeah, innovative.
Blue sky thinking, right?
Exactly right. So look, as we'll talk about more in the next episode, at around this time, the Australian Crime Commission starts sniffing around at the links between organised crime and the importation of sports supplement and performance-enhancing drug. And this all leads to a place where in 2013, Essendon self-report for possible violations of the anti-doping code as part of what they might have been injecting into people, and there's a joint investigation, and ultimately doping findings are made against the entire Essendon player group by WADA, and they're all suspended for the entire of the 2016 season. So here's the gobsmacking bit to me, right? To this day, the players do not know what they were injected with. They signed medical consent forms. The leadership team looked at what they were being injected with, but no one can prove actually what they were injected with. And there are still players who are calling for a royal commission into understanding because no one has ever gotten to the bottom of it.
Again, to draw the thread back a bit, like we've even seen in the last kind of 6 or 8 weeks, people whose robo-debts were written off or repaid, etc., and they are still trying to find out, sure, but what happened? Like, what basis? How did you get there? So it is interesting that we can put so much effort into investigating and still not ever make a decision or have the capacity to get to people's individual kind of circumstances. It is amazing that, I'm assuming there's a record-keeping thing coming up here, Caroline, like how on earth it's humanly possible not to know what one was injected with would mean that it wasn't written down, springs to mind as like a...
Yeah. So, look, exactly right. And so in March 2013, sort of soon after Essendon has self-reported into this kind of frankly, a shit show of an ASADA process that takes, in the end, a couple of years. They commissioned Ziggy Switkowski, if you all recall, Telstra's Ziggy, to write a report on the governance failures in Essendon that got them to this place. So they recognise really early that something has gone wrong in the governance of the club over the last couple of years that has led them to this place where they just don't quite know. Look, the report itself is not much loved, because it didn't do all the sexy stuff about what did they actually say and who did what. But I would say for us public service nerds, it's actual gold, because I think it really captures the kind of toxic brew of characteristics that leads to something like this.
All right, so what was it Ziggy did say then?
Well, I alluded to some of it up front. One thing he points to is the significant change in the Essendon Football Club in the rebuilding phase after iconic coach Kevin Sheedy left. He points to the fact that in that rebuilding phase, of the 20 top executives at Essendon Football Club, only one had been there continuously for longer than 4 years by March 1st, 2012, and that there was really significant and high turnover that accompanied the change of coach. And then he also talks about how James Hird came in and he's this darling and everyone sort of wants to please him and wants him to succeed. And then he points to the growth of the organisation itself. So AFL footy clubs used to be really small and now they're really big, the
Behemoths, yes.
Right. So $50 million revenue, full-time staff of 75 and 35 more part-time staff. And in his observation, the commercial side was very well run, but the footy side was kind of much less well governed, and it was much more autonomous and kind of worked separately because it really held the power in the organisation. And so, once you start getting this little piece of once you start getting this innovative practice over in the kind of footy side of it, it was really hard for the rest of the organisation to keep up and keep track. Does that sound kind of familiar?
Well, and also not really, I assume, not really built for it. So, the speed with which AFL professionalised was enormously fast, and so I wouldn't have thought Essendon would have been alone in the idea that, footy coaches train footy and we've become commercial, and because we've become commercial, we need to, do this deal with this sponsor and this deal with that. But the actual footy part of it, the transition, I see this scandal in some ways as the transition from old footy to new footy, which was old footy was smartest footy bloke we could find and we kicked the ball anywhere he told us to and we jumped anywhere he told us to. Yep. And also that was a masculine command and control kind of environment. Yeah. And so the idea of governance of the coach of your footy club in the 80s and the 90s is bizarre. I can't actually even conceive of how it used to be run in that sense of you would never have had someone telling them that someone could review the decisions that they were making or the plan that they were doing. They were the coach of the club.
Do you have a delegated authority to, nothing like that,
no manual, right?
Yeah, so exactly that. I think Ziggy says, in 20 years ago, so he's writing this in 2013, so in the 90s there were maybe 5 people in the AFL footy department. So that's your coach, your trainer, your physio. By 2000 there's maybe 10 people. But by the time he's doing this review just 10 years later, there's 30 to 40 people on the footy side of the organisation. And so they are... There's no, there was a real challenge, for example, in understanding who Stephen Dank, the sports scientist, reported to.
Where did he fit? I assume that we were still pre-org charts in this kind of world.
Exactly. But also the absolute primacy of the footy ops part of the department, of the club. That's what we're here for. We're here to win.
Yep. I once ran into Kevin Sheedy in the Clifton Beach supermarket in Far North Queensland and had a yarn with him about football, and I can assure you that I would have had trouble giving him instructions in any way, shape or form as a god of football philosophy. And so I think the other problem is the deification of various individuals. And this turnover that you're talking about from the old guard to the new guard is really common, I think, to the rest of our stories and it makes me think a lot about, we've talked a bit about employing leaders and how some of them are BAU leaders and some of them are reform leaders, and starting to make me think that we need to be more comfortable with constant incremental change to risk manage against having this new broom 100% flip type change because of the risk of kind of corporate knowledge or... there is something here about doing things exactly the same for a long time and then a new person blowing it up and building something new.
Yeah.
That's a pretty common government corporate way of doing things, is the same for a long time and then big change.
Yeah.
Not even, in central agencies, departments of Premier and Cabinet and Prime Minister and Cabinet, like, we turn over secretaries and chief executives like no one's business.
How do you have continuity in that context, right? Like, and especially in a central agency where the vision of what a central agency does can be so different. Like, you don't, the business as usual can be whatever.
And I get it. It's a tough job and you don't always need the same person at different points in your electoral cycle or other things. But it's difficult when the thrust and direction of an agency changes every year and a half, 2 years.
Mm. Yeah. And yet then you flip it again, and we've all inherited or come into roles with teams that have had really long tenure.
Yes.
Where it's very, very hard to try even the slightest new thing. And so there's something about balance in all of these change things around there shouldn't probably be teams that have been exactly the same for 15 years with the same personnel, same processes, same everything.
Yeah.
And that does lend itself to we've got to shake this tree really hard because we're now really moribund, but not end up turning over people every 18 months to 2 years. There's something really important about balance, I reckon.
And it's that same thing that we've talked about in Robodebt, where on the one hand you have some staff potentially who might complain about any change.
Yes.
Against, or not against, and how you distinguish them from other staff who might say, I'm not against any change, but what you're doing here seems sus.
That's
because
right. It is missing...
Yeah, I do think it's weird to be injecting players off-site.
Super
and that
weird.
it was right for people to start to go, if everything was totally above board on this one, why aren't we driving out to a little medical clinic in the middle of suburban Melbourne for this?
Yeah, with some compounding pharmacy that we have to drive to the other side of Melbourne to get the... Like, absolutely. Like, and someone did say that. Sorry, Danielle, to cut over you, but just to say, someone did say that. So, this team gets on board in, like, October 2011, and in January 2012, Bruce Reid, the club doctor, writes a cracker of a letter to James Hird and to the CE of the footy club at the time, where he talks about, like, fundamental problems being the club doctor when he's seeing players receiving supplements for 3 months and he's not getting any of the information. And then he's like, last week the players were given subcutaneous injections, not by myself, and I had no idea that this was happening and what drug was involved. Like, he is absolutely furious. But how is he viewed? Well, Ziggy's report says... The attitude of some in the new fitness team, the Essendon Football Club medical personnel, were yesterday's men, not abreast of the new methodologies, excessively conventional, pharmacologically illiterate. They were part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Excessively conventional. Jeez.
That doesn't feel that unfamiliar.
No.
I know.
I've been called excessively conventional, although different words were used.
I was thinking about some of these moments where we've had to be kind of keepers of institutional knowledge and tradition, and that is the kind of pushback you get where it's like, oh, you're just an old fuddy-duddy who doesn't know. Well, sure, but like also you're injecting these kids.
And that's it. I mean, when you get to that I'm assuming we are talking kids, and in my head, of course, I always think of like your first 18, your names who are on big money, but of course an AFL squad is actually made up of not that, in the sense of the bulk of it, and they're all like, I would describe them in this, if we're doing all the comparisons and the bad analogies, as the labour hire where they haven't made the first but they haven't made the first grade. They really want to. It's their life stream, and they're not going to dob even if they're not sure, on anyone.
Absolutely. Let's have a little listen to what Nathan Lovett-Murray, who was a player and a mentor to Indigenous players in the team at the time, told Emma Murray on her great podcast, The Long Haul, recently.
You get there as an 18-year-old and you're pretty much just told what to do. Every minute of the day, you've got professionals in fitness, in weights, in diet, football, and I guess you trust them, and so you sort of hand it all over, and you just go with the flow, and you get told to work as hard as you can, and you'll be rewarded. So that's the environment of an AFL club.
Which is where it is. I think where I can start to contemplate AFL players as the little guy, because they are, some of them kids.
They are actually kids.
Not only an unwillingness to dob on others, but they know that it's their job to perform and to win, and they'll do what anyone tells them to do if they think it's going to get them there.
The investment in them to date, my understanding, I actually know a couple of kids in that kind of pre-AFL bit now, and that is a family that has driven from here to Timbuktu, who has paid money for this camp and this thing and that whatever. And so they actually carry a lot of not just their own ambition, but I think a lot of their own I need to repay the investment in me type feelings.
Yeah.
And I think also when we're talking about them being kids, there's always that moment, which for me was quite a while ago now, where I was like, I could be half this team's mother. All right,
I know.
Cool. Right. So I think when you are in your own 20s, they all look the same. When you get to a certain age, that's when you start to realise the difference between 17 and 18 and 28 is absolutely massive insofar as your agency in the situation.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm really pleased you guys have come around on that, because I was quite upset before when you were mocking the idea of the players as the little guys, because I really think there's such an enormous power imbalance. But I also think, so one of the things that I think for James Hird in this place, and this really plays out, is that footy clubs are really cloistered environments, right? As you say, Danielle, you kind of come through school or through whatever kind of, training program you've come through. James Hird came from the Ainsley Football Club, former birthplace of my daughter, Ainsley, but anyway, just saying. But then you get into the club, and then you're in this institutional structure, and that's your entire organisational experience, and it's how you learn what an organisation does. So James Hird comes in, he's been in this organisation pretty much his whole life. He's had sort of 4 years out since being captain and come back as coach. And he gets this letter from Bruce Reid in 2012 saying, what's going on? I think there's some real problems with the program. It's all very well to say it's not banned, but actually it might be banned, and I haven't seen, just because it's not classified as illegal doesn't mean we can use it freely, which I think is an excellent quote. And so James Hird does what he thinks is the right thing, and I think he thinks it's the right thing because he's completely naive and doesn't understand how organisations can and do work. So he goes back and he says, right, okay, we've got these worries. Excellent. We are going to make sure that this program meets these 4 principles. Any supplement must be WADA and ASADA compliant. It must not be harmful to players' healths. Players must be properly informed about everything entering their bodies, and every product must be cleared by the doctor. They sound pretty good. Right?
Sounds very reasonable.
Very reasonable. As Ziggy says, guidelines, reasonable and unambiguous, but compliance required robust recording and monitoring processes, and none of that happens. So Hird has this thing, it's a bit like Scott Morrison with Robodebt. I said, go make it okay, but he doesn't do any of the follow-up to work out how it was made okay. And here's the bit, it was not okay.
And so it's not just James Hird though, right? He sits in an entire governance structure.
Mm-hmm.
Where was everyone else in this? Where was the board?
Well, so one of the things that Ziggy finds in his report is that the board was not explicitly looking at issues around welfare, around player welfare. And so he sort of talks about the fact that the board should in future have a kind of line of sight to thinking about player welfare. And this really reminds me of the Robodebt recommendation around frontline customer service interaction. Like, you have to be in touch with what's actually happening in your organisation and not just kind of, you know, in the strategy space. But the other thing he says, and it's interesting because it's not quite clear in the report what he means, but he talks about bad news not being passed up the line. So when this letter goes to James Hird and the club CEO, and James issues his very reasonable kind of response, no one sends it up to the board to say, oh, hang on, we've come up with a risk. And he talks about sometimes organisations seem to have holding depots where issues await a fix while being shielded from upper management and the board. This is poor practice. Boards should ask the question, what's keeping you up at night, and follow up and monitor actions and concerned. And I think that's where the board was. They were like, oh, yeah, stuff happening in the footy department. We're actually doing pretty well. You know, our boys are looking big and strong. We're doing all right in the season. Jobe Watson's just won a Brownlow. Like, you know, they don't want to dive into it. They're just like, keep on going.
You got to know what questions to ask. So we are back to ground zero here. You got to know what questions to ask. You got to have the routine reporting of some description, and so that you, even if you are not asking the right questions, you can use the data to go, I'm seeing a pattern, I can see a problem.
Yes.
And I find it hard to imagine, again, I say this is the transition from old footy to new footy, that there was like a, whatever the version of a people survey is that gives you the data, or like, so that there is a question of the how, right? Like let's imagine there was, and I'm very much imagining that there was this one person on the Essendon board who was like, hope everyone's all right, XYZ, I've got this thing. I'm not sure that, I mean, that's all well and good, but unless everyone's saying
do they care that everyone's all right so long as they're winning?
Right. And I think that's one of the questions.
There is a kind of like almost meat marketness about how clubs treat their players.
And it's worth saying that, like, I think the AFL Players Association has a funny role in this. Like, they had just only a few years before, they had lost a very successful head of the AFL Players Association, Andrew Demetriou, who went in to be AFL CEO. But it's unclear how activist they were at this point in raising concerns about, oh, hang on a second, not just at Essendon, lots of our guys are off getting these random injections. Like, there was no sense of kind of a work health safety kind of culture and all of the usual checks and balances you find in that.
Also, is there... So I've often wondered this in relation to AFL generally, and in relation to when COVID hit, etc., in relation to when games could be played and bubbles and whatever else, which is... like, when your body is your professional something or other. Your
income, essentially.
Your income. Like, do you still go to the GP when you have a sniffle, or, like, I would say that there's a line of obligation that's not in relation to doping, just to be abundantly clear.
Yeah.
Like, doping in or out, regardless of whether you're doing it in your bedroom or at the off-site thing or at the club, that's out.
Yeah.
But, like, it's not I wouldn't say it's a straight line of accountability or anything else, in the sense that also comes down to those, like, can you have a beer in the off season, and like the policing of that stuff is a murky line. Like, it's the same vehicle that you use in your other life as well. So it's not like so that means you've got two doctors, for instance, and they're potentially giving different advice, and one's giving it to... I don't think
they see anyone except the club doctor.
That's right.
Actually.
They have one doctor who has one interest.
Exactly, and it isn't necessarily their interest.
Which is really interesting. In fact, one of Ziggy's recommendations, sorry to cut over you, Alison, but one of Ziggy's recommendations is that they should reconsider having full-time club doctors, because he says that you might well have a better outcome from doctors who also have a private practice. And I think the implication is like both up to date with what's happening, but also like much less captured by the interests of the club.
Absolutely.
Actually, they are doctors first, not Essendon Football Club employees first.
I know that there's often big physio practices that give out their physios, pay their salaries, but give them out for not necessarily top-end AFL, though including top-end AFL, but certainly lower grades. And I don't think the WAFL has full-time physios. I think they have kind of volunteer ones that's considered good marketing for practices kind of thing. And I know that can be quite conflicty, where like the games, a best physio advice might be to come off the ground for X, Y or Z reason. A good outcome to this game is to keep playing. So there is a real conflict as to who you're working for and who you're delivering for when you're giving that advice.
Yep.
And so I can see how this is an interesting sort of sideline in organisational culture gone wrong and a governance failure. And I am excited in our second episode, because I've done a bit of background reading on how this thing connects into your ASADA and your WADA and how that plays out from a governance perspective. But Caroline, we've spent a bit of time talking about the players, and you wanted to finish by hearing from one of the players involved.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that is underplayed in this story is the disproportionate impact that this scandal had on Aboriginal players at the Essendon Football Club. Essendon Football Club has a really proud history and a really strong Indigenous program, and when you hear Nathan Lovett-Murray talk about how he felt as a leader in that group for other Indigenous players, you begin to feel the quite specific damage in the trust that was broken between the club and the players in this context, in that really kind of particular power dynamic. And before we go to hear him say that, I will just say he also talks about the really great work that the club has done in rebuilding those relationships, and it's really done a lot of work to kind of change its culture and make sure it gets back to a player first and a welfare first culture. But in these years, I think less so.
All right, so let's go and have a listen to that, which will wrap up our episode. Till next time.
And looking back at it, I should have had my own legal counsel that were giving me this information. But all I had was the football club and, to a certain degree, the Players Association. And I guess, it just wasn't good enough.
When you went back home to Hayward, could you see the effect that the report and the allegations and the process around that had on your family?
Yeah, I think more out of their concern for my, welfare and mental health. And that was a big reason why I wanted to go home, and just to sort of, connect back to country, connect back to culture and connect back with family and elders, because I was hurt at the time and, needed that love. For myself, the biggest disappointing thing for me was, having, the younger, Indigenous players there, and, the guys that I was sort of, mentoring and, go through this program as well, and see them being impacted. So that was something that really impacted on myself a fair bit, and, still sort of, got to live with that today.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.